Governments are no longer asking Canadians to self-isolate. They are enforcing it in some places. People who choose to ignore the appeals to stay home are being hit with stiff penalties and fines. CBC's Arthi Pole is working on the story. So what's happening then to people perhaps who don't follow the rules, Arthi?
Well, it's interesting, Suhana, because a lot of people seem to think, oh, these are just guidelines from provincial or federal officials, but actually law enforcement is acting on those rules and regulations. And under states of emergency declarations, for example, they do have different powers that have been bestowed to them in order to enforce these things. A couple of quick examples that I want to share with our viewers. For example, we had heard that earlier this week there was a gathering in Brampton, Ontario, outside of Toronto. It was a party that had been called in to the bylaw officers. Bylaw officers showed up at the residence, and they told CBC News that when the host of the party and the guests refused to abide by the rules that have been set in Ontario to not have large gatherings that were non-essential, but not have any large gatherings, they called in Peel Police, and essentially there was a charge laid there against the host. They were charged under the Emergency Management and Civil Protections Act, and that can carry a fine of up to $100,000, and there's a court date set for June 20th. So there's one example for folks. But of course, this sort of thing is happening across the country. For example, we know that in Newfoundland, the law enforcement agency there has a crackdown team that's looking at complaints, that is following up on anyone who should be isolating, who should be in smaller groups, who is not. Quebec, we were reporting yesterday how they have just started implementing checkpoints to make sure that travel is essential and that non-essential travelers are not getting through and potentially continuing to spread this virus. Also in Ontario, I had one example there from Brampton, but we know there could be up to 1 year in prison for non-compliance. Also, the City of London, Ontario, had set up a tip line in order to not inundate 911, and a reminder for folks, they shouldn't be calling 911. Typically, it's a bylaw officer in a lot of these jurisdictions that's handling this, and that London, Ontario tip line received more than 1,000 complaints since it opened last Friday. So that is one way that people can flag whether or not individuals are breaking the rules. In addition to that, Saskatchewan, you can see $2,000 for a fine for delinquent travelers. And also in British Columbia, it's up to $50,000 for non-compliance. So there certainly are rules and regulations that are in place and are being implemented. So just another piece of advice for those out there who seem to want to continue to flout the rules: you could get hit hard in the pocketbook too.
And Canadian leaders who believe that, there are many of us, many people, I'm getting it, but I'm not going to include myself in that group, but some people are not getting the message, specifically when it comes to self-isolation. What are those leaders saying, Arthi?
There has been a very consistent message across the country from municipal leaders, from provincial leaders, from federal leaders as well, saying that not only is this a betrayal and a disappointment, but you are putting everyone at risk. And again, with these new law enforcement agencies or the powers that are bestowed upon them, you can also face charges and fines. So let's quickly take a listen to what several of the leaders across the country are saying. Take a listen.
You need to stop looking for loopholes. This is not a game. It doesn't seem that common sense is very common in certain sectors.
We all need to take this very seriously. These are not suggestions, they're the law.
Each one of us has real power here to avert the worst case scenario.
So what we're seeing here is, again, a very consistent message that they are hoping people finally understand. Certainly, it doesn't feel that everyone is getting the message when we hear these stories of people holding house parties and law enforcement agencies having to go and break those up. But certainly, we are hearing the same message from all of the provincial and federal leaders and from municipal leaders. And, they've also said that nothing is off the table to crack down even further to ensure people stay at home, Suhana.
Thanks for that, Arthi, and you stay safe. That's CBC's Arthi Pole in Toronto.